time I do talks like this, and it's our birthday year this year, we've been in existence as a specialist domestic violence charity for 40 years. We know what we're dealing with, and we know how to work with domestic violence. And the scale of it shocks me every time I say this statistic. 1 in 3 women in her lifetime will experience domestic violence, and 1 in 6 men. That is an awful lot of people. And why is domestic violence not a national scandal? I don't understand. So the approximate percentage of women and men experiencing domestic violence in any one year, 7.3% of women and 5% of men. So how can this be right? I'm going to look at some frequently asked questions. How can that be right? How can that figure be right? Why does it take an average of 35 incidents to report? And why might she go back to a manipulative abuser? When I first heard this statistic as chair of Women's Aid, I did a kind of Rolodex check in my head of my acquaintances. I thought, well, I don't know. I'm sure 1 in 3 of my friends have not experienced domestic abuse. And I started talking to my friends about being chair of Women's Aid. And a couple of things started happening to me, one of which was that one of my closest friends in the inner circle, you know, your closest 5, said to me that her first marriage ended because of domestic violence. I've known her for 15 years, she never told me that before. And secondly, a woman I've known at the school gates for maybe 25 years sat at my kitchen table and said, what have you been up to, Jill? I've been speaking about domestic violence. The figures are shocking, 1 in 3 women. And she said, I think it's more. And she's the only woman who's ever said that to me. But then she went on to talk about her own experience, her 2 sisters and her mother. I work as an HR consultant. I travel around the country and meet lots of charities. And quite often I say I'm chair of Women's Aid. And the number of times the chief exec or the HR director will say, oh, my sister, my grandma, my mother. By talking about it, it takes the lid off it. It's a very hidden issue. Why? Because it's difficult to talk about. Once you're through it, you don't want to dwell on it. Why would you have a conversation with someone about an experience that you've passed through? Culture or society doesn't always identify it as abuse. What is a normal relationship? Women and girls are often not believed. Why does it take a woman so long to report domestic violence? He may have isolated her. It's one of the tactics of an abuser is to isolate the woman. He may have broken her confidence, taken her independence, worn her down and put her down, frightened her, taken or controlled her money, manipulated her emotions so she believes she is in the wrong. The line, you made me do it. I only did it because of you, because of something you said or did. And she's been targeted by a skilled abuser. Some names at the bottom there, Reva Steenkamp. If that incident didn't involve domestic violence, I would gnaw my own arm off. It's so ridiculous that the judge did not identify that as domestic violence. For a start, she said she was frightened of him. There was evidence of that. Previous girlfriends said they were frightened of him. It happened on Valentine's Day, which is a kind of a spike of incidents of domestic abuse, and she had locked herself in the bathroom. One of the things we say to women who phone up on the helpline, if they are frightened for their life, at that moment, is to run and lock yourself in the bathroom. I don't believe that was an accidental killing. Nigella Lawson. It just goes to show that domestic violence cuts across class. Having access to money doesn't make you exempt. And if you're a Radio 4 listener, Helen in the Arches is a perfect picture of a woman who's being manipulated at the moment. Someone's trying to come in. Why is it so hard for a woman to leave? She's scared. She has no money. She doesn't want to split up the family. Her children may already blame her because the abuser has said it's mummy's fault. She has no confidence or independence. And the skilled abuser does not want her to leave. He's happy in this relationship, or content at any rate. He has the power and control. And why might she go back? He's still targeting her. Women are often targeted for up to 2 or 3 years after splitting from their abusive partner. And these days it's through texts, through internet abuse. So who experiences it? These are some famous younger women who have all talked about their experience of domestic violence. Don't ask me who they all are. I'm in the wrong generation to know. So it involves controlling behaviours including physical, psychological, emotional, sexual or financial abuse. And one type of abuse rarely exists in isolation. An abuser typically uses a range of the above behaviours to establish and maintain control. So the effects of domestic violence on adults, we can see some of them there. It's a long-term effect as well. It's not just something that you get over in an instant, or even after you've left. And the impact of domestic abuse on children. Now, we heard earlier that 750,000 children every year witness domestic violence. We have a case in the refuge at the moment of a family who came to the refuge with 3 children. The eldest was 3, a little boy, a toddler of 3. He's covered in bruises and has carpet burn marks down his back. What happened to this little boy was that his father decided that he should walk up and down in front of him and be kicked every time he went past him, up and down. And when the little boy put his hand out to stop him, he was told that he had 30 seconds to get to his room or else. He didn't make it. He was then pulled downstairs, which resulted in the carpet burns, and then beaten until he was unconscious. And this is a 3-year-old boy. The 18-month-year-old was also injured, and the mother had been prevented from taking her children to the doctor because of the manipulation of the abuser. These are the kind of cases we are dealing with in the refuge, day in, day out. Our dedicated staff sitting on this side of the room are the ones who have to face this kind of impact on children and women, and also on men. Men do experience domestic violence. 1 in 6 men in their lifetime are likely to experience it. Women are more likely to experience repeated and severe forms. So what do we do then as Women's Aid? We've been around for 40 years. Our aim is to improve the lives of survivors affected by all forms of violence and abuse. We do crisis intervention. We do preventative work as much as we can. But this is one of the types of work that has been cut. Our work in schools, for example, working with children, with young people on healthy relationships, is vital as a preventative strand in working with domestic abuse, but we don't get enough money or time to do it. We support women and children on their journey away from the abuser and afterwards back into some kind of normal life. And we try and empower women as much as possible so that they don't go back, so that they can find the courage on their journey to free themselves from domestic violence. These are our services. So that's an ISVA. There's a few bits of jargon for you. Independent Sexual Violence Advocate. Helpline. We run the county helpline with volunteers. Karen over there, volunteer coordinator. We do training for professionals. We train the police. I recently spoke to a group of social workers. Who else do we train, Pam?
Health,
GPs, all kinds of people. IDVA, an Independent Domestic Violence Advocate. Caroline, you're an IDVA. How many IDVAs do we have?
3.5.
3.5. And You only get to work with an IDVA if you're at risk of serious harm. So these are the women most at risk of serious harm. And our IDVAs have a caseload at any one time of 30, at least, individuals they're working with through the courts. Outreach. Trish is one of our outreach workers in Oadby and Wigston. So she's working in GP surgeries with women who have called the helpline or after they've left the refuge when they're moving on.
They also come to, they might turn at the side of the fair at the children's centre, which is walking.
That's Trish. And we work with children as much as we can, but again, that is one of the areas that has been cut during the austerity the last 5 years. We have had specialist children's workers. Have we got any at the moment?
There was me.
There was you, Trish. So that's the impact on our services. We haven't got enough staff. We also have the Adam project, which again is just about to lose its funding. It's a specialist project for men, victims of domestic abuse, and particularly a helpline. But the heart of what we do is to provide refuge. And why we do that is because we don't want women to be killed. That's the long and short of it. 148 women were killed through domestic violence last year, and we want to prevent that as much as possible. In fact, here's a statistic for you. More women were killed in 2014 through domestic abuse than in the soldiers in the last year we were in Afghanistan. I'm going to move on to talk a bit about politics now. So the impact of the austerity agenda. We actually have a greater need for our services, and domestic violence increases in a recession, which we've also just had. So, for example, referrals to our IDVA service have increased by 60% since 2010. There is less money for services, and we have the commercialisation of the provision of services through local government, through competitive tendering. So the estimated cost of domestic violence to society in monetary terms is 23 billion per annum. In Leicestershire, there are 90,000 women and 30,000 city women affected. That's the statistic about 1 in 3 in her lifetime. County police receive 7,600 incidents of domestic abuse per annum. In 13-14, we delivered services to over 1,250 adults, 1,400 children, and 300 callers to the helpline. So the problem increases and the funding decreases. CAB services, so Citizens Advice Services, reported an increase of 11% in 2013 compared to 2012 of domestic violence advice queries. We have our own helpline statistics which show that the helpline rings off the hook. And it rings off the hook with a wide range of callers, including women who have to be advised to go and run to the bathroom with her mobile phone. There was a loss of 37 specialist domestic violence services in 2014, and we are 200 bed spaces short nationwide. So on one typical day, this is National Women's Aid, does a survey every year of all the women's aids around the country that are their members. And on 1 year, on the 27th of June 2014, 103 children and 155 women were turned away from the first refuge they approached. Now, you only go to a refuge either if you're referred by the police or other social services. It's very unusual to have a woman, no one knows where the refuges are, so you're referred. You're at serious risk of harm at this point. With National Women's Aid on their website have done some really interesting work on the costs of preventative work versus repair work. So I don't know if you're going to be able to read these, but you can certainly look at them later on the National Women's Aid website. So these are true stories of domestic violence journeys. And I may just have to read out to you the fare on one side versus the other side. So in early intervention from some specialist domestic advice The cost is reckoned to be about £5,000 for this woman. And on the other side, if she doesn't get early intervention, £78,000, because she's repeatedly homeless, she has to access far more services. So the tragic thing is that our services are so cost effective, it's unbelievable. But does this get taken into account? From our perspective, it feels like it doesn't at all. What we do is really worth it. Just moving on to look at the voluntary sector as a whole, we are a charity. This is the change in voluntary sector income between 2011 and 2012, so it's not even up to date. But in terms of the kind of charities that have lost most money, so I don't know if you can read that on the pink side, it's social services. So that's where we come. We are a social service charity. So our sector, our part of the voluntary sector, has lost most money under this government's austerity agenda. So in terms of the voluntary sector as a whole, I think we can categorise it as a struggle with change and insecurity. In Women's Aid ourselves, we have made ourselves more efficient. We have moved offices to be in smaller offices. We have asked our key workers to take a pay cut, never mind a pay rise, over the last 3 years. We actually had to ask them to take a pay cut. Nationwide, the losses are especially high in local government and national government funded groups. Now, traditionally domestic violence charities have been funded from local government because we've had a symbiotic relationship like this with social services, and they recognise our expertise as specialists. We help them because we know what we're doing on domestic violence. We know what to do. We are the experts. That's when it worked. Now it doesn't work. Specialist services have been disproportionately hit, so services for black and minority ethnic and violence against women and girls. Advice services are hammered, and that's continuing. So if you are a woman in need, your options are running out. Equality impact assessments. This is what is supposed to happen by local government and national government when they look at policy changes. They're supposed to look at the impact on women and children. That is not being done. And the impact on women is disproportionate of the austerity agenda. And there's information on the TUC website about that. They've done a research report on benefits cuts, the cumulative effect of benefits cuts and services cuts, which are disproportionately used by women. In terms of the local political landscape and commercialisation, obviously we have the localism agenda and particularly commissioning models. We are at the sharp end of commissioning. The latest tenders to come out are out at the moment, and they are all payment by results. So that means that when we tender, we have to tender against other people, other less specialist charities than ourselves, or any provider. It could be Serco. It could be Capita running domestic violence services. The bigger organisations can run on economies of scale, which we can't. We are a small, local, domestic violence specialist charity. We are already as efficient as we can make ourselves. Payment by results means if we don't hit the targets that are set for us in a particular month, our money is cut. So that means we have to run our services and employ our staff without a month's money. It's a commercial, it's a company approach, not a charitable approach to running organisations. Again, there's recent Act of Parliament that says that commissioners are supposed to look at what's called the social return on investment of tenders and social value. And again, our experience of tendering is that they don't. They just don't bother because it's hard. We also have the police and crime commissioners and the health reform and the CCG, so we've had to cope with all of this change in how local services are funded and delivered over the last 5 years. It's not easy. It means we are cut to the bone. We've had 5 years of austerity already. And one of the politicians recently said, oh, well, you've done 50%, so the next 50% will be easy. And I'm thinking, what kind of world does he live in? You know, imagine we're in a Jenga tower and we've got the 50% out and it's rocky. How is taking the next 50% out just as easy? It isn't. It's not possible. And quite soon we are going to be prevented from tendering because it will not be possible for us to deliver services at the price that is put out at. Because then we're just basically asked from our charitable money to subsidise the government services, which makes me furious, actually. So what should charities be doing? I don't know if anyone remembers Brooks Newmark. He kind of passed through the charity office, a job or whatever they're called in Parliament, and he maybe infamously said, what charities should do is stick to their knitting. So this is the kind of knitting I'd like to stick to. I mean, obviously that's a kind of a peace example, but I think we should knit a great big sign that says, you know, we are valuable and we're not going anywhere, and hang it outside Town Hall, perhaps. We could think about that.
I think the best sitting is so it's been dropped in his City Hall because he's vacating Town Hall.
Well,
I mean, it's far better though, it's more attractive because it's nice lawns and everything in the fountain.
We'll hang it. We'll knit something appropriate and hang it somewhere. So, from our perspective then, politicians of many colours don't get the voluntary sector and they certainly don't prioritise domestic violence. I feel a despair, and my board members with us and my staff members with us, at the lack of alternative narrative about what is happening. Politicians are not offering credible solutions. The only thing that I hear from politicians is which flavour of austerity would you like? And quite honestly, I don't want any more austerity in the area of domestic violence services, because we won't be here. And that's not because we're thick or stupid or we can't tender properly or we're not businesslike, because we are. We run a business with 34 staff and a £700,000 turnover. I won't talk about that one actually. So, Future Transnational. Basically, the state is shrinking, and it looks like that's going to be pretty permanent. And society since the Second World War has been based on assumptions about growth continuing at 2.5% to 3%. And all our assumptions about living standards, what the state should provide, how much better off the next generation will be than the last, are turning out to be wrong. And that includes domestic violence services, services for women in need, services for people who can't buy their way out of trouble with a shed load of cash. And this, it feels to me like the debate we're not having about what kind of state do we want, what kind of local government do we want. I was on the radio this morning and it said to me it feels like the debate about local government is about libraries. We hear a lot about libraries closing down. We hear a lot about bins. Are the bins going to be collected? We hear about potholes. Are the potholes going to be mended? But what about our domestic violence services? When they're just gone, just like that, then what will we do? So what will happen if wall is not here in 2016? Now we know the cost to society of domestic violence already is estimated at £26 billion and a huge amount of human misery. But I can tell you, and my staff can tell you, that without effective crisis work, more women will die. More children, like that 3-year-old, will be beaten up. Without effective repair and rebuilding work, women's and children's lives will be blighted. And without effective preventative work, domestic violence will continue to rise. Now, this is the debate I want to have, and is this what society really wants? I don't think it is, but I don't think people know. I don't think we talk nearly enough about these kinds of choices. which is why we wanted to invite our prospective parliamentary candidates to come and talk to us or give us their view on what they think they would do if they were elected into government or the mayoral office. So thank you very much. I've finished now. It's been a pleasure talking with you.